So, good afternoon. My topic is extremely wide, and I try to manage from the topic using the concept of three urban fabrics. As you heard, so that's a concept that I have been working with quite a long time and last few years quite intensively. So it's not all new thinking, it's a new way of organize thinking. And Kuopio has been a pilot city or pilot town to develop this concept. And I'm speaking mainly of the basis of my speech is based on my experience in Kuopio. I'm also using some figures of Belfast, but they are just more like illustrations of this presentation. Don't take them as serious research figures. They might include also some mistakes. But anyway, I use them to make it more understandable what we mean with this three fabrics concept. So I've been working in Kuopio since 1993 with this concept, and Peter Newman, Jeff Kenworthy, they have been working 30 years analyzing different types of cities globally, and they are quite famous researchers. And so when we met 3 years ago in Perth, so it was very obvious that we have two very parallel ways of thinking which should be combined, so that when they have been studying different types of cities, I have been studying and using different types of fabrics inside the cities, so it was very obvious that these fabrics are the explanation of why cities are different. So car cities, automobile cities are car cities because the car fabric is very strong, and transit fabric, walking fabrics are weak. Transit cities in Europe, they are transit cities because they have very strong transit fabric, and the car fabric is not dominating. And so, combining these two research lines, we came to common concepts and even a theory. This slide is giving two of the basic explanations why the fabrics exist, why they can be found in cities. The figure on the left is showing the waves of innovation, meaning that the innovations have been developing like waves, developing all kinds of groups of innovations, and some basic things: a steam engine, with trains, then electric streetcars, trams, metro systems, where the next wave, and then motor cars were the third wave, and so each time the means of transport became more effective, it gave potential for cities to grow larger. The other figure is showing so-called daily time budget, constant, which is very obvious and found by researchers that it's a basic feature of human race, that they can use about 1 hour for daily travel. But if they have to use more than 1 hour, so they feel it uncomfortable and try to change the situation. And so together this development of transport systems and this daily budget for traveling, so these are the explanations why cities have certain similarities concerning the fabrics. We have made this kind of concept which is illustrating the basics of the fabrics. the basic groups. Walking urban fabric in two categories, transit urban fabric in three categories, and auto urban fabric or car urban fabric, covering them all. They have, the basic thing to understand is that they are overlapping. So it's not only zones, but they are overlapping systems, overlapping fabrics. And especially in city center, all these three fabrics are overlapping. And they have certain dimensions, and these dimensional circles are some kind of basic measurement showing where to find the fabrics. Walking fabric is inside the radius of, circle of radius of 2 kilometers. Walking fabric is the inner fabric based on trams and buses is within 8 kilometers, and the fast light rails or local rail or metro systems can extend it up to 20 kilometers. In smaller towns, that was the concept of a big town, about 1 million inhabitants or more. In smaller towns, cities, they don't have this outer transit fabric. They have, basically, the cities are within the radius of 8 kilometers, and then there's the city region with all kinds of small towns or villages or just groups of housing. And so basically cities like Belfast or Finnish intermediate cities that I've been researching, so the basic concept to study them is within radius of 8 kilometers. The same things, same layers, but the distances, and the same distances, but the scale is this one. And it's not only the whole city, it's also the same time budget can be recognized also in local movement or local living styles. So that people, when they are walking, when they are pedestrians in their local neighborhood, so the bed shed is has certain cycle, and when they are using the car for daily shopping or something, so it's another radius. This is also something which can be found. And when we speak about neighborhoods or habitats, so it can be clearly seen that there are three different types of neighborhoods or habitats. The ones in the walking fabric area, we could call them neighborhoods of the walking fabric, neighborhoods of the transit fabric, and area or neighborhoods of the car fabric. And when have been working with this healthy urban planning, so we were using the health objectives produced by Healthy Cities Network, and we used them to analyze the urban fabrics in Kuopio. And so it was very obvious that these habitats, there are three different types of habitats. One's in the walking city fabric, one's in transit city fabric, and car city fabric. And once they were assessed, so it was quite obvious that these neighborhoods or habitats of the walking and transit fabric, they are promoting this health objectives, most of them. Whereas when you look at the habitats of the car fabric, so even if they can be very comfortable and nice from many aspects, so they, in terms of health objectives, they have quite negative results. And the most important, they have negative impacts to the other fabrics, to the habitats or neighborhoods of the transit fabric and the walking fabric. Okay, that was the theoretical part, so I don't go deeper to that because I don't have time. But there are the books I was showing you and the article which is coming to be published, so they are giving the basics. Now the next stage is I take examples of how this can be seen and applied in real life. First, the core of the walking urban fabric, so within the radius of 1 kilometer. So this is a figure from Kuopio showing the basics, so that the CBD, which can be developed into the core of the walking fabric to the pedestrian center. So it's usually within the radius of 250 meters in a small town or city, and can be extended up to 500 meters in bigger ones. And then it's surrounded by the fabric which used to be the walking fabric and can be revitalized into modern walking fabric. In Kuopio, the CBD area was turned to pedestrian center, so that when it used to be very dominated by car traffic, so about 20 years ago, so in 20 years it was turned upside down, so that now the cars are underground. There's parking for 1,300 cars under the main square, and about 3,000 car parks inside the walking, the pedestrian center. So it's very effective, but the parking is not anymore disturbing the pedestrian fabric, pedestrian environment. And also the buses, we have kept them in the city center, so it's also the center of the transit fabric. The area around the pedestrian center, it's been also renewed, so that now it's really becoming a walking fabric. We have new housing for about 4,000 inhabitants there, and in this housing, for the first time, it was also housing for carless inhabitants, so that 1/3 of the apartments were without parking place, which is different from what we used to have. And then we have a special network of laneways, which was turned into pedestrian streets or pedestrian laneways. So we have now a pedestrian street network covering the whole walking fabric, about 10 kilometers. And at the same time, we changed also the system of the whole walking fabric. The streets used to be one-way streets with green light waves and quite fast driving, so they were turned into two-way streets. About 5 years ago, the whole street network was turned to two-way streets. And now with the pedestrian center and the two-way streets, all the through traffic has disappeared. And the streets going around looking for a free parking place, so that's disappeared. So streets are quite free for walking, cycling, and also for the cars and the buses. So it was really made it peaceful. Okay, Kuopio is only one example. A good example is Vejle in Denmark, which they have an excellent pedestrian street, with parking facilities in one end in a mall type big units and some smaller ones here. But once they have made it very appealing, active, and high-quality walking pedestrian street, so it's combining and collecting people even from the neighboring cities, which are in the distance of 30 kilometers, and it's really a growth potential for the whole city. The same is happening in Finland. In Tampere, for instance, it's a city of almost the same size as Belfast, so they are making the main street turning it into pedestrian streets, and they are cutting the through traffic from the whole area, which is shown in blue color here. You have plans in Belfast which looks much of the same as in Tampere and the other cities, and that really looks good. And when you look at the dimensions of the project, so it seems that you are covering the whole potential CPD area, turning it into more pedestrian-oriented fabric. In bigger cities like Helsinki, this pedestrianized area can be even a bit larger than this half a kilometer. Or the diameter can be a bit more than 1 kilometer. Some words about the other part of the walking fabric, the area which is surrounding the intensive walking fabric. It's usually very fragmented area. For instance, in Kuopio, when the walking fabric is here, so the surrounding area is really fragmented, and it's very often, or basically, it's the elements of the car fabric, like here in Minneapolis, which is, I could say, extreme example of how freeways are surrounding the whole city, and this potential area for walking fabric, or which has been a walking fabric, so it's been turned into really dominated by car fabric. In Belfast, you have the same type of elements here, and when I look at your development schemes of the city center, so you have noticed how these elements of the car fabric, they are limiting or cutting connections between the inner part and the outer part of the walking fabric, and that's very common problem. Something needs to be done with these elements of the car fabric, because this is really good potential area for future growth. All kinds of brownfield developments can be implemented, and they are all within the walking distance to the city center. Some words about the transit urban fabric, and basically mainly about the inner area, which is within the radius of 8 kilometers. So this radius of 8 kilometers, as I told, it comes from the technology. The trams, originally, they could travel in half an hour. You could take a tram from the edge of the city to the city center, and this, once more, Minneapolis, it used to be one of the leading transit cities in the beginning of last century. And this is an example of the present well-functioning transit city, Köln, which has all the cities, all the functions of the main functions of the city are within the radius of 8 kilometers, and they have a network of light rail, not only the radial, but also not only the star-like lines, but also the radial lines. So it's really effective network. Freiburg has been shown as an example of a new transit city, which is functioning well, and that's been explained or presented in several publications. In Finland, Finnish towns look like this in intermediate cities, so that they have transit fabric which was constructed mainly in the 60s and 70s, and then some new precincts of transit fabric, but then it's surrounded with areas of the car fabric, which part of them are very car dependent, and some of them are combined with the transit fabric. Some pictures about Belfast. It was interesting to see that your tram network, which could be found from internet. So it seems that that's the explanation of the denser parts of Belfast. So if you look at the population densities, so these denser parts are covering the same areas that you used to have. They used to have the tram system. Then the trolley buses, the network of trolley buses is covering most of the areas where we have the urban population at the moment. So that basically that's showing that the basis of Belfast is a transit. It's a transit-based city. But the densities are different in different parts of the city, and the lifestyles, I think they are even more different. This is a figure which is interesting, showing the households without a car, and the dark ones are the areas where more than half of the households didn't have car in 2001. Situation is, of course, has been changed, but not too much, I think. And when we compare this, so that's gives some thinking about the network of public transport is covering the whole area, but the carless people are living mainly here within the walking distance to the city center, or then the western parts, which are now covered with good bus lanes, better than the trolley bus lanes. But from this figure, you could conclude that the walking and transit fabrics can be found from these areas, and these areas are more or less car-oriented, car city fabric. And when you look at the shops, different types of shops and location of shops, these blue ones are more or less car-oriented shopping units, so the same conclusion can be made. In Finland, in Kuopio, we were following this analyzing these fabrics, and we have quite good data about how they have been developing. For instance, the car ownership according to these areas of the fabrics since 1992. And this was interestingly showing that people living here in the walking fabric, inner or outer urban fabric, and on the red areas of the transit fabric. So the motorization rate was not it was growing, but not very fast. And still, and even now, it's less than half of the motorization rate of the areas of the car fabric or the city region. And that can be seen in the other cities too. This carless housing, carless people, they are not disappearing. It just seems to be just the opposite. This one. I've been speaking about densities, but it's not only about the densities or population densities, it's more about neighborhoods and habitats or settlements, and we felt that it's important to recognize the transit units, transit-oriented housing units, neighborhoods, and how to promote, how to regenerate them, and we have been even constructing new neighborhoods as supplementing the fabric, the whole fabric, using a finger model. I give you as an example this one new precinct of transit fabric, Särkilahti, where we changed totally the principles of design. So instead of having the main street and buses going around the precinct, so the buses are going in the middle and bus stops are here in the middle, we made even a bus bridge only for buses to combine the new precinct to the old neighborhood. And the most important part we were studying was the public space of this new precinct, It's in the center, opening to the sun, towards the sun. It has the children's playground combined to it. It has a shop and the bus stops. And so even if this is a small precinct, only 1,300 inhabitants, so it has become a small settlement or society, so that people really walk here and meet here, and you can see urban life, even if it's small. This is a special element which we're using and which should be used, and it's more and more popular to use this kind of elements. A bus bridge, which allows the buses to use one lane in two directions, and it's not for cars or taxis or anything. You have this bus rapid transit lane. It's very interesting and going to the same direction. Here, this is very strange in Finland, because buses are usually using main roads, not coming inside the neighborhoods. And we learned from this that once you have this compact small area, so people are using the buses, they are using the local shop, they are even meeting each other here, even if the unit is small. The same conclusion, I think, can be done from Freiburg, from Vauban area, which is also kind of iconic. It's been presented in all planning books, and it seems to have it has the same dimensions as I've been speaking about. So the surface is about 300 meters is a maximum, or from the edges up to 500 meters, but it's very compact, and the green areas are not inside the precinct, they are outside. And that's very interesting concept, because when we compare it to the concept that we have had in Finland, our neighborhoods, even the bus-oriented, or neighborhoods which should have been bus-oriented, so they have been designed using this kind of concept where you have only open space here in the middle. If you compare it to Vauban, so when Vauban has all the people living here, so in the Finnish neighborhoods it's just forest and a place for a shop, and the street network is very difficult for proper bus service. And you have a different concept for neighborhoods. You have this high street concept, which is quite close to the concept of Vauban, and I think that's a good basis to continue when you compare it to Vauban. So basically this concept, for instance, is showing the same dimensions for the more compact fabric. The problem, and it can be seen here, for instance, I just picked from the map this Woodstock Road, which looked like the type of the neighborhood or high street, which has active services in the middle and short distances. But then you have also other type of neighborhoods or high streets, which are showing that you have, in addition to the high street blocks by the street, so you have quite large areas which have quite are not within a good walking distance and look like areas of the car fabric. And for instance, this example is really coming towards the car fabric. It has one big shopping unit for daily goods here in the middle, not too much people living here, and then most of the people living outside the good walking distance. And this high street model or this kind of models are especially problematic if the main road cannot be, or the traffic cannot be removed somewhere else, if it's dominating the whole neighborhoods or the central areas of the neighborhood. Usually when you speak about transit-oriented development, so you speak about rail stations or rail stops, and that's been studied and promoted for a long time, and it's interesting to see that here the distance is, for instance, this Kaltop from 1993, he is proposing the same kind of passage, so that the neighborhoods would be inviting for walking. Rail systems in intermediate cities, they are becoming more and more popular. This is from Tampere. They are planning to have 2 light rail lanes, but here we can see also the problems. Tampere center is here, and here's a kind of new town with a lot of inhabitants, so this lane is upgrading the public transport, and here's also the central hospital, which gets new connections. The other line will be constructed on almost empty land, and so they have a project to have new precincts built on the area occupied from the lake, and so this is for the first time in several decades in Finland. An intermediate town is building a chain of precincts based on public transport, which is very interesting. And that's the question also, I think, here in Belfast. The bus rapid transit connection to east, it's clearly serving the park and ride system and people who are coming by car from the city region. The other line is going inside the neighborhoods, inside the residential areas, and that's something which I think is giving good potential for upgradings of the present precincts or neighborhoods. I don't know how much you have been studying it. This auto-open fabric, I don't have much about it. We know in Finland that people like to live in the areas of the car fabric because they can come close to nature if the areas are well designed, so we have good recreational routes and bicycle roads, and school children can bike to school, and these are very comfortable. The only question is that the amount of the share of car fabric should not be too high, because then it's causing the negative impacts, too many negative impacts. One basic way how to improve the fabric of car fabric is to build new bicycle roads, and that's becoming more and more common, and it's very effective way to get part of the people from the car fabric to active travel and at the same time subtract the amount of car traffic in the city center. This kind of schemes were very usual at the end of 60s. I think almost all the cities had transportation planners where traffic plans where the whole city was covered with freeways and main roads, and this is the plan from Belfast. Part of it has been implemented, but not all parts, and that's what happened in most cities, not in car cities. This is an important figure about car city fabric, the negative impacts of the car fabric is that if you want and need to develop precincts which are oriented towards public transport, so you shouldn't allow shops or shopping units of car city type within the radius of 1 mile or 1.5 kilometers, because that's destroying the potential of the transit-oriented precinct. We have seen that very clearly in Finland, in Kuopio, for instance, the shopping units which are car-oriented, so they have cleaned the area surround from local shops, and the same type of fabric can be seen here also in Belfast. This one figure to save time. So in intermediate cities you usually have this kind of situation as you have in Belfast, that there are several small towns on the city region, and the main question is how to promote alternatives to car fabric, so car traffic, so that the commuters wouldn't use only cars but would use local trains or buses. Some words still about the combinations. When I've been speaking about the three fabrics and the areas of the three fabrics, so it's also very important to understand that they are not only overlapping, but they are in many ways combined together and should be combined together. But that's the confusing part. For instance, Michael Jenks, who's been writing much about sustainable and cities, so when he's classifying different types of neighborhoods, so he's using the central neighborhoods, which are close to the same as I've been speaking about, the walking fabric neighborhoods. Number three is suburban neighborhoods, which are the car fabric areas or car fabric neighborhoods. But then the neighborhoods which should be transit neighborhoods or transit-oriented neighborhoods, so he's calling them neighborhoods in between. And that's a good word in a way, because they are, in practice, they are in between. They are a mixture of car fabric and transit fabric. And it's really challenging to find ways how to promote the transit elements and qualities of the transit fabric instead of letting them develop into neighborhoods or units of car fabric. In Kuopio, this is a good example of the combination. One neighborhood has compact inner area in two parts, and then car city type urban development surrounding it, so that they are working in a symbiosis consisting of making a unit. The other example is from Kuopio, how to combine the area of the transit fabric and the area of the car fabric. We did it in a big scale, building a special street to combine these remote areas to the city center and to combine the fast areas of the car fabric to the city center, using the new areas of transit fabric in between. We were studying two alternatives. The other alternative was we were assessing what would happen if we wouldn't build the street, if all this area would be just constructed as areas of the car fabric. And these two alternatives were assessed, and the assessment showed that once we build this kind of transit fabric and a new street, so it will cut half of the emissions and energy consumption of the traffic of the new areas. So from ecological point of view, it was very clear that it's wise to make this kind of new element and new transit fabric to combine the remote areas of the car fabric into the city center. But we had to use special elements because there was a beautiful lake with small islands which could not be destroyed, so we had to make a special street which was totally different from the conventional roads of the car fabric. And so we made a kind of landscape street which is mainly for cyclists, recreational pedestrians and the buses, but also for cars. So to conclude, I was picking three things for conclusions. First, Peter Newman and Jeff Kenworthy and the others have noticed and are explaining when they have been following the automobile cities and the growth of the motorization of cities, that we are facing, or we have faced a period of peaking. So even the motorization has been peaking in the United States, in many other cities, United Kingdom. This is now not the latest, but it still seems to be peaking, and it's peaking on different levels. Denmark, for instance, which has strong walking and transit fabric, so motorization is peaking on the level which is lower than 400 cars for 1,000 inhabitants, when United States is peaking on the level of 800 cars. So from here we can see the influence of the fabrics, but we can see also that something is happening in worldwide. So car fabric motorization, which has been the driving force for 40 years or 50 years in cities. So it's not anymore the main driving force. When Newman and Kenworthy have been looking at the world cities, so the cities which are developing or which are leading the development, so they are not because of the car fabric, but because they have been oriented towards the walking and transit fabrics. They have new effective walking and transit fabrics, and that's why they are inviting, innovative and growing. And that's the challenge for any city, for Belfast also too. It's not only to have effective car fabric, but it's to have inviting city center, inviting neighborhoods, which are inviting enough to keep people, innovative people here, and to invite more people and companies to the city. The other conclusion is dealing with the neighborhoods of the transit fabric. We've been analyzing several cities in Finland since 1960, the fabrics, how the population of the walking fabric has been developing, how the population of transit fabric has been developing, and the car fabric. And from this time series we can make forecasts what will happen. And there's two basic options. One is that transit fabric, which is the main fabrics, majority of inhabitants of Finnish intermediate cities are living on the areas of the transit fabric. If it's regenerated and extended, so the city can grow quite fast, even if the car city fabric would not grow at all. It can even lose its potential. On the other hand, the other alternative is that if we don't take care of the transit fabric, so it will face a decline and lose population. And in that case, we still have to grow or to keep constructing new areas of the car fabric, extend the car city using the elements of the car fabric. And this kind of development will face the facts that cities don't have resources for this kind of development if they want to keep their place in the competition. So the options in the walking fabric, there are some options, but the alternatives are not very effective. Not here in the car fabric, but here in the transit fabric. So that's where the cities can and should find their future solutions. If they succeed, they can be sustainable and developing. If they don't, so they will face problems. And in terms of this healthy objectives and challenges from climate change and so on, so it seems that these walking and transit fabrics have really good potential to face the challenges, whereas the car fabrics is even now problematic and seem to become even more problematic in future years. So this was the second conclusion. The third conclusion, this is now in Finnish. It's just showing what we are doing in Finland. We have a large project of Finnish Environment Institute is studying, analyzing 16 Finnish cities, trying to analyze and find different types of neighborhoods, precincts, small units, so that here one type is good area, good precincts or neighborhoods of the transit fabric, basic units of transit fabrics, and then the car fabric, and to find ways how to upgrade all of these. Upgrade all of these in terms of how to make them more inviting, how to make them more sustainable, more healthy, how to make them to promote to stop the climate change and so on. And so that's something which should be done in each city, not only to concentrate in the city center or the main development projects, but the whole city, all the inhabitants, all the habitats, to find ways how they can face the future challenges and the situation. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for the invite to speak today. What I'll do is I'm going to talk about a project which we've been taking forward for some time now with the Scottish Government, with NHS Health Scotland, which is the public health board for Scotland, and Architecture and Design Scotland, which is the public body for architecture. I'll go through the tool in a bit of detail. In a nutshell, it's an evaluation framework for the quality of place. It's a collaborative tool. But what I'd like to do before that is just give a bit of context about this, a bit of context about the evidence, some of the thinking drivers behind it, which might be familiar to many of you here, so apologies for that. But also a little bit about the drivers for this piece of work as public policy, and the public policy landscape in Scotland generally. There is a term called the Scottish approach to public policy, which has three fundamental components. One is that public policy should be assets-based. And by that, it doesn't just mean physical assets, it's talking about assets that communities have, their own resource, their input to processes themselves. Clearly, there's a spatial element to that as well when we're thinking about assets. The second one is co-production. So this is about communities being involved in the design and the delivery of services that they receive, very much about doing things with people and not to people. And the last one is improvement too. So that's partly about gathering data, gathering evidence and learning lessons. And I think a lot of these bits of data and evidence don't need to be empirical. A lot of it is about opinion, it's about views of people which actually become the real realities within communities themselves. And the other side of the context, I suppose, is about Scotland's health, which has not been what it should have been over the past 50 years. and Sir Harry Burns, who's the former Chief Medical Officer at Scottish Government and now Chair of Global Public Health at Strathclyde University. He's done an awful lot of work around this, and a lot of work when he was with Scottish Government around the complexity of Scotland's health, why we are where we are. If you look at Scotland's life expectancy 100 or 150 years ago, we were the European average. From the 1950s onwards, we have been declining, but now Scotland's life expectancy is amongst the lowest in Western Europe. And the reasons for that are complex, and we don't fully understand what they are. When it comes to issues around obesity, of diet, of smoking, Scotland's rates in this area are about the European average, and yet life expectancy is lower, particularly around the Strathclyde, former Strathclyde in Glasgow city region area too. Part of it relates to Dundee as well. Former industrial areas, which around the 1950s had substantive sort of change in terms of their socio-economic circumstances, the demography, what people did for a living, the sense of community that they had too. And a lot of this work has led to some theories about why Scotland's health is not what it should be. And Harry Burns has said that the problem with Scotland's poor health is the health of the poor, that we know so much of this is linked to areas of deprivation. Glasgow Centre for Population Health has done some studies comparing Glasgow as a city with very similar UK cities, so Liverpool and Manchester, again post-industrial cities. When you strip out some of the socio-economic circumstances there, you find that Glasgow has up to 30% premature excess mortality. We don't fully understand where all of this is coming from, what the drivers are. 12% of that 60 is related to heart disease and stroke, 12% to cancer. 60% of that 30% is related to drugs, alcohol, violence and suicide. And what Harry Burns has been saying for some time is that by lowering cholesterol in people, you are not going to start tackling what is a very complex psychosocial process within communities which leads to poor health outcomes. So some of that has been the driver for the work for the place standard, and I suppose around public policy on architecture and on placemaking generally. First thing to talk about is what we mean by place, and this is a definition which is in the architecture policy, and it says that place is a physical environment in which we live, which is what most people understand it to be. But it's also the people that live there, and it is that complexity of the relationship between people and their environment. That is what place is. So place, to some extent, changes, it evolves over time, it has an impact on communities' sense of who they are, and what we know is it has an impact on physical outcomes too. The term placemaking, certainly in Scotland, sometimes is seen as a slightly fluffy term. It's seen as high-quality development. It's a placemaking type scheme, when obviously all development makes places. It's just to do with the impact that that development has, whether it's negative impact, which sometimes it can be, whether it doesn't do enough for communities, or whether really it is improving the quality of life for people. And we know that the quality of life, the sense of community within areas, is to a large extent conditioned by the physical environment, cycles of regeneration, what we have done in terms of housing, whether that has been about taking down former slums and putting people into what was more appropriate accommodation, but perhaps didn't fulfil the social circumstances that were required there. So cycles around that too. Issues that we know to do with identity, of self-worth, of the assets that a community really has, what they can aspire to over the long term. And then there's issues about land use planning and how we use land effectively, how we join things up. So this is a typical distributor road that you would find in a lot of post-war development, which does one thing, and that is it moves traffic very efficiently, and it will there'll be a coefficient about the flow on that road which will work perfectly, but as a sense of place, as something which is about people, it is deficient. And then there are the neighbourhoods in which we many of us live, that have been built within that sort of period too. But they tend to be a monoculture, they're not mixed, they're not the type of communities which were built in the past. And I suppose what we see is that when there are changes within the environment, that monoculture can really lack some resilience actually too, and it can steadily decline. And this is a slightly unfair comparison because this is Barcelona. This is Diagonal, which runs across Barcelona. It is effectively that sort of distributor road type model which we saw before, carries an awful lot of traffic, but people live there, people work there, they walk, they cycle safely, it has green infrastructure, and it's starting to pull together the elements of place that we know are important to be sustainable and to be valued by communities too. And yet, what we see a lot of is anywhere development which lacks that resilience and ticks certain boxes, but as a whole is less than the sum of the parts. We know we can do better development. We know that we can do better housing, that we can master plan more appropriately. And this is the Scotland's Housing Expo, which was in 2010. But we've done it very successfully in the past too, so it doesn't have to be glamorous. This is Leith Walk in Edinburgh, which is a main artery. It's close to the city centre. It links Leith Walk, which used to be a separate town, directly to the city centre. And it's a very mixed neighbourhood. It's mixed in terms of its income levels, in terms of its demography, its ethnicity. It has a variety of different uses. There's a very high residential population. It's got community uses. It has real value, and it's shown amazing resilience over the past few years when it's been under significant pressure from the economic crisis and from some tram works which ultimately weren't delivered to the area in the first phase. Part of the reason for that is about understanding the assets-based approach, because the area just to the left of that image there has the highest residential density of any area in Scotland, so higher than the high flats of Glasgow and Dundee. So that density in itself is an asset, and it's a particularly strong asset when it's combined with the local services that it links to and that it supports. So why we're interested in place and health inequalities is that it supports our agenda very much. It's linked to prevention, and out of that list there about how the environment relates to health, what we're interested in most is the last point about place creating or nurturing health, so it being a positive health asset and understanding how to do that too. Physical inactivity, we know, is a huge issue and the fourth leading risk factor for global mortality. And estimates put the cost of obesity in Scotland at up to £3 billion by 2030, which suddenly doesn't seem all that far away. And yet we know, this is a UK statistic, that 20% of people walk for 20 minutes less than once a year or never. So 1/5 of the population are never walking for a period of 20 minutes at all. Part of that's to do with the environment in which they live, what we consider perhaps green space to be, whether it's real amenity or whether it is complying with a regulatory requirement, about the types of environments that have been created over time which are not maintained, left to dwindle. And yet we know, of course, the benefits of activity are really something which we need to take advantage of. So really significant benefits here for chronic and acute diseases just through 30 minutes of moderate activity 5 days a week. So a brisk walk to work, stretching out as if you're trying to catch a train or a bus. And the assets that place and design has got, when streets are designed for walkers and not cars, people are 25% more likely to walk to work. Nearly 80% of journeys under 1 mile are made on foot. So people will walk if you give them the opportunity and if you support them in an environment in which they would like to walk, in which it's pleasant. So we know about physical inactivity, we know that has a big role to play. But when it comes to understanding the complexity of Scotland's health statistics, there is an issue about social cohesion and about hopelessness, about an asset of understanding the environment in which you're in too. And Harry Burns did a lot of work around this, part of which was motivated by this chap who's Aaron Antonovsky, who was an American sociologist. And what he said was that our lives need to be comprehensible, manageable and meaningful, or we experience a state of chronic stress. Chronic stress is linked to early mortality. And what's interesting about this actually is that there were studies done in Whitehall about the level of stress which they measure through cortisol in your saliva. And they used the civil service to do this because it's a big organisation and it's relatively sort of benign, so they had a great test group there. And what they found is that Levels of cortisol, the stress hormone, are lower the higher up the chain you go and higher the lower you are. So people with the most control in their life, despite the fact that sometimes they have stresses, they have peaks and troughs, have lower, that base level of stress hormone is generally lower. And it's in part because they are able to delegate, they understand their environment very well, and they can, to some extent, control it. That is linked to chronic disease such as heart disease. And so what Harry Burns has been talking about is that we actually are starting to understand the biology, the molecular events that relate to levels of cortisol and its ability to take fat through the bloodstream, how inflammatory response can make your arteries stickier and can actually lead to fatty deposits on that, which is linked to poor physical outcomes. So the biology of this has become clear, and it is about prevention, it's about understanding, not to spend money necessarily on finding cures, but on using health, on using place as an asset. It's not just about health for us too, it's about other things. So when you think about, say, the town centre agenda, footfall can boost trading by up to 40%. Good quality urban design can raise retail rents by up to 20%. These are not universal figures, these are studies on individual places. And some studies have shown that pedestrians spend up to 6 times more than people who arrive by car. And other studies have shown that retailers themselves will overestimate the number of people within their shop who arrive by car by 100%. So some retailers think that twice as many people have arrived by car than really have. There's issues obviously for carbon too. And transport accounts for nearly a quarter of Scotland's greenhouse gas emissions. Cars and vans account for 55% of that too. So it's not just the big freight here, it is about cars and vans. And short trips, many of which can be taken on foot, not all of them, account for a significant part of that too. So what we're able to do is to start to make incremental changes here through walking and cycling. They have multiple benefits. So the place standard itself is a reaction to many of these issues. And its purpose is to support the delivery of high quality places in Scotland to maximise the potential for physical, social environment to support health, well-being and a high quality of life. What it's really about is getting people together to talk about the issues which we know can make a difference if solutions are applied properly. It has 2 origins. One, within our architecture policy, creating places. We had a commitment to develop a place standard there. At this point, the thought was that this was something perhaps more akin to Cave's Building for Life, which would probably be related to suburban development and to design quality. But what also happened around the same time is Good Places, Better Health, which was a report from the Ministerial Task Force on Health Inequalities, recommended the development of a Scottish neighbourhood quality standard because they understood the links between health and place quality itself too. So the 2 projects were brought together, hence the reason why we worked with NHS Health Scotland and Architecture and Design Scotland. Principles, very simple. What do I need to live my life? How do I get there? How do I move around? And is the experience good enough? And I can't stress enough how important that last qualitative thing is. Is the experience good enough? Because that is what makes a difference to communities, to their likelihood of walking, of cycling, to their sense of self-worth, or whether they live in an environment which is hopeless and alienating. What is it? So it's an assessment tool to evaluate the quality of place. It can evaluate existing places, new places, or plans for development. It's based on 14 simple questions. So to that extent, it is similar to the Building for Life model. It creates a graphic output. We've avoided a scoring mechanism which can stigmatise communities, and sometimes actually it does not describe actually the conditions within that area. So we have a graphic output, but fundamentally what we want to do is to get people together to do this assessment in a group, to collaborate and to work towards co-production models. So what you would do is you would decide on the area to be assessed, obviously. You work through the questions, you use ratings to produce the diagram, and you can reflect on the outputs. There is space for you to list your priorities, etc. within it. These are the themes in question. So some of them are very familiar with in these sort of place check type of tools around public transport or traffic and parking, which we know is a big issue. Some of them are slightly more sort of slippery, and actually they tend to generate more debate that around things like social interaction, identity and belonging, an important one, influence and sense of control. It's an online tool, but it can be downloaded too. It's very simple. You work through the questions. There are prompts there to aid the discussion. We really want the discussion to become a sort of a real contextual analysis of the place itself. You can use the tool online, or you can download it, as I say. You rate out of 7. You can put comments down as you go, and at the end of the process, as I say, you get this diagram. And what we see that as is an asset map, really. It is about the strengths, the weaknesses of a community. It's focused on the strengths. It's not a deficit model. It's about promoting growth in areas where communities have identified priorities. And so the purpose of it really, apart from getting people together to work collaboratively and to identify what priorities are, is to a large extent about plotting improvement. There is no benchmark. It's not about scoring 50% or to fill the whole area with colour. It's about improvement. So if a community decide that they're scoring low on public transport, or if they're scoring low on streets and spaces, these become the priorities for them. That over time they can work with local authorities and development industry to make interventions and to plot improvement or otherwise about how things have worked effectively. In terms of its use, we see it having widespread use, and for us the next year is about implementing it and understanding where it can really add value. It certainly has use for development planning, main issues, etc., as a pre-application engagement tool for developers. We think it has application at development management stage as well, but critically we also think it has a strategic role to play, and we've been working with some local authorities to pilot the tool within that strategic area about how they prioritise spend and how that prioritisation forms a consistent conversation with communities who are working on the ground on things too. So it's been piloted across Scotland. The next year is about continuing pilots, even though the tool, as I say, is now published. So the outputs is about analysing what priorities are, but the conversations which come out of this, the collaborations between communities, local authorities and developers are really what we want to see. So much of this is about conversation and communication, but what the tool does is it pulls that conversation into something which is at least consistent and linked to some of the outcomes that we know can make a difference to health. Thanks very much, that's all I was going to say.
So I suppose just for 5-10 minutes I'll reflect on where I am and the fact that I've come here having been head of planning in Cardiff for a number of years, the role that I have in the context of the Royal Town Planning Institute, and as a plug for the Institute, I would suggest, if you already haven't read it, have a look at the centenary papers which were produced in 2014, which deal with a lot of the issues that we've been talking about today. So my first impressions of Belfast, it's a very friendly city. You're very friendly people, but paradoxically, it's also a segregated city. So there are some challenges around permeability and connectivity. It's car dominant. I think Belfast fabric is very much the auto fabric that Leo was referring to earlier. And there are issues around how we ensure that there's some change, some transition around the way in which the car is clearly the basis and the mode of transport for this city, and how other cities have used that challenge to try and break that modal shift to a point where there are better and a wider range of alternatives to look at getting from A to B. I think the other point I'd make is that it is the environment within which we're working, and I say we in a collective sense, it's a pretty disaggregated governance arrangement. I've come from a place which was a unitary authority, so it had responsibility for planning, transport, regeneration, education, all in one place. I think the challenge for Northern Ireland is around how we take things forward, particularly, say, in this agenda and other agendas, despite the governance arrangements, and how, in the short term, we have to do that with this disaggregation that clearly is set for some time. I suppose I was attracted in part to the role because my title includes planning and place. It's actually being very positive as a city about the emphasis on placemaking, around how urban design solutions are key, particularly in the context of the Healthy Cities agenda. So planning powers have been devolved. I think there are issues around capacity of local planning authorities to use those powers in a positive way. I think there are issues around capacity of statutory consultees. For example, NIEA and transport planning, who are key actors, if you like, on the stage of delivery. And we need to ensure that we can deliver, again, in a position where they, as key players, have an active role to play and do so in a timely fashion. I think Belfast, of course, is unique in the sense that there's been depopulation over many years for unique reasons. It probably is a small city geographically. Its 8-kilometre boundary is probably akin to the definition of small city. There is an issue, I think, around how we ensure that the local development plan frameworks that each authority is creating, how they all knit together, how, as pieces of a jigsaw, if you like, they tell a collective story, a picture around the solutions for the whole of Northern Ireland. Inevitably, that introduces the question around the city region, and is that a solution, or should we be making our own disparate plans without that connectivity and that engagement? I would say that the integrated transport solution is fundamental to it, as is the infrastructure plan. In the local development plan that Cardiff produced, which incidentally took over 4.5 years to produce, aligned with it was an infrastructure plan which identified infrastructure deficit, which was significant, in the region of £700 million. So where are the transport solutions? Where are the drainage solutions, for example, in the context of delivering the next range and round of local development plans? I was going to ask a question of Leo around governance arrangements, which I've touched on, but also the funding regime within the examples that he gave. If there is that infrastructure deficit, where is the money coming from? Is that a shared responsibility for local government, for the private sector, for central government? Is the European funding that may be something that can be tapped into? So the whole sort of solution, in part, depends on a funding mechanism. So that sounds negative. It's not. They're just challenges for us, and I think positively the devolution of powers for planning is now at home in the right place. Issues for the future, I think there's a partnership that the local authorities need to have with the business sector, with agents and architects and planning consultancies, so that we get a quality of input, there's a quality of throughput in a timely decision-making process, and that there's a quality of output when we get the right decisions in the right places for the right reasons. I've touched on strategic transport, which I think is a regional issue, and that has to be looked at in line with a number of the local development plans that are being prepared. I suppose one of the other things which struck me about the city is the concept of city centre living, and I just don't mean student populations, but Clearly, the city of Belfast has two significant universities which make very positive contributions to its economy. It has its challenges around that, but where is the other city centre living concept, that ability to walk from A to B? Because the question is, where are you walking from and where are you walking to? If you're walking from the place that you reside to the place that you work, and it takes you 8 to 10 minutes, that's great. But if you look at the city centre, very few people actually live within it. So there's an issue around that. I think I'll finish by saying that I've touched on permeability, I've touched on the connectivity between places, and in terms of permeability, in terms of that shared space concept, I think the starting point is the city centre itself, and then how you use that as a basis for saying it is there for all the residents of Belfast, all the people that commute into work, all the people that come here as tourists. And then once you've got that sort of cultural shift around shared space, it can permeate out into other areas of the city beyond the city centre. I think it's a collective responsibility that we have. Local government can't deal with it on its own. But I think if we start to articulate that dialogue for the city, taking on some of the best practices that have been shown across Europe, and some of the ones that have taken place within the rest of the UK, I think we're in the right place. And provided we engage, provided we listen to each other, then we can find a collective solution to it. So thank you for that. I hope I wasn't too controversial. I wanted to be slightly controversial, otherwise there's no point in being here. I've done my bit. I think I'm going to hand over to Joan, who's going to allow a question and answer session for a period. Thank you.